Hey guys, how you doing? So in this video we're going to look at the scientific names and understanding species through scientific names. Okay, let's jump straight into it. Okay, binomial nomenclature. You will often find that when you look at the names of organisms that they have this kind of common name, which is a normal one we're associated with, and then sometimes in articles and things like that, you'll also see that they have this kind of extra name that's a bit random in some sort of different language. And hard to understand. Now that second name, that scientific name, is actually a system in which we've put in place to tag and identify every species unique from one another. Yeah, and so we actually call that binomial nomenclature. The word binomial meaning two names, nomenclature meaning a way in which we name. And so we name them by giving two parts of the name. Both of them are usually in Latin, and so that's why we don't always understand it. It was devised by a man named Linnaeus in 1758, and what he's done was that he would put the genus name of the organism first, and then he would put the species name of the organism second. And so the genus name's in capital and the species name's in lowercase, so that you can always identify what that organism is. Yeah. It's widely regarded as the most precise level of identification by scientists, and it's easy to sort of identify an organism based on its scientific name rather than its common name. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Homo sapiens, that is actually humans. The genus Homo refers to man, and the word sapien refers to modern, or means modern, and so Homo sapien is modern man. If you look at another kind of organism from the genus Homo, you could look at Homo neanderthalis or Neanderthals, which is what people would have thought were preceded humans, I suppose. Now, another one, Canis familiaris, Canis referring to canines, and familiaris referring to family dog. Yeah, so that is the scientific name for the family dog. Panthera leo is the scientific name for lions. Panthera is the genus for big cats, and it encompasses all big cats, including tigers, jaguars, and panthers and things like that. Okay, and Leo refers to the lion, and so Panthera leo is the lion. Okay. Okay, the advantage of using scientific names, it's universal language. Most of it is in Latin, and so it doesn't matter if you're studying an organism in English or in French. The common names might be in English or French, but the scientific name is in Latin. Scientific names are unique to each species. Every species has a scientific name attached to it, and so no two species will share the same scientific name. It gives some measure of indication of how species are related. Yeah, Panthera leo for the lion, Panthera tigris for the tiger. Okay, and sometimes common names can be a little bit misleading. Yeah, so two organisms may actually share the same common name, but they will not share the same scientific name. Okay. Now, to look at how we use that, we have to understand, okay, how do we actually identify and classify species? And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what are the methods in which we use to determine that this set of organism is one species? Yeah. So a good question to ask is, for example, why are all breeds of dogs considered the same species, but dogs and wolves are actually considered entirely different species? If you just take a look here, if I match up, a few different breeds of dogs, you notice that they look absolutely nothing alike. Yeah, they vary in size, and shapes, and colors, and in features. Oops. However, if you look at the dog and the wolf, they are extremely similar in features, but they are considered as different species. Yeah, so if you look at these two images here, the one on the left, if you can figure it out, is actually the grey wolf, native to North America, and the one on the right is actually the husky. Right, and so they're entirely different species, but they look so similar, and yet we see dog breeds being extremely different, but being the same species. So what is it that scientists have to consider when they are when they take a group of organisms and they put them into the same species? Yeah, it's not a easy thing to do because organisms can be quite dynamic, but there are kind of three main ways in which we do that. Yeah. We have the classic definition, the biological definition, and the modern definition. And one of the things that you have to note is that none of these methods are perfect. Okay, the classic definition uses structural similarities, The biological definition is basically identifying them as the ability to interbreed between one another, and the modern definition is identifying them using similarities in their DNA. Okay. Now let's look at the classic definition. Basically, what we used to do is, if they look similar, they must be the same species. Now, hopefully, you can immediately identify that it can be confusing to try and recognize some species, because you immediately notice that some species, they might be the same species, but actually, genders within the species or individuals look extremely different, like, for example, dogs. Now, this is the superb bird of paradise. Yeah, it is found in tropical rainforests all over Southeast Asia, and it looks like this. Now, one of the interesting things to note is that males and females of the same species have what we call sexual dimorphism. And so that there is the female, and that face that you are seeing right now is actually the male. Yeah? That's not actually his eyes, that's actually the pattern of his feathers. And that's him putting on a mating display. Yeah, that's him without the display, and that's him with the display. And so if you looked at this and you had never classified this species before, you would look at it and you would immediately think that they are completely different species, but they're actually the same species, but the only difference is that one is a male and one is a female. And so sexual dimorphism, the fact that males and females look differently, can be confusing in terms of classical definition. Okay, wolves and dogs, two different species, looking very similar. If you saw this, if the husky was a little bit of a dark color or the wolf had a lighter coat, then you would probably think that they were the same species, but they are actually not. Another good example are elephants. Using classic definition, if they look similar, they must be the same species. This is the elephant. This is its closest relative genetically and in terms of kind of lineage as well, the hyrax. Once again, you can see there, elephants and hyraxes are completely different, but in size and in features, but in terms of similarities, they are actually the closest related to one another. Okay, so that is the species definition. Why do we use it? Simply because it's easy. It's easy for biologists to walk into the field and identify them using their structures rather than having to look at a sample of DNA. Okay. Biological definitions. This is probably another way in which we can identify species. If we take two organisms and we put them together and they can interbreed, and the young they produce are fertile, we generally call them as the same species. This is probably a little bit more kind of sure than the classic definition, but once again, you get problems as well. Hybrids, organisms that come from two different species, can actually occur. That there is the liger, or a crossbreed between a lion and a tiger, a male lion and a female tiger, producing an interbreed hybrid. Now, the liger is actually infertile. In other words, they can't actually themselves produce young. And so it's easy to get that confused if you were using the biological definition. Mules, horses and donkeys breeding together form mules, also infertile, so it's a bit easier to tell them apart. But you can sort of see that it can be a bit confusing, because in some situations the hybrids can actually be fertile. For example, dog and wolf hybrids are actually fertile, and they will often produce young of their own. And you also have a few other species that actually kind of just throw the whole kind of system out of whack. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. In California, there are 7 different species of lizards, and each of those species are unique because they come from different regions around the coast of California. And this species here, Oregonensis from Oregon, can breed with the picta and the platensis, but it cannot breed with all the other ones. Picta can breed with Oregonensis and Xanthoptica. Yeah, I'm having trouble pronouncing some of these words as well, right? But they can't, interbreed with the others. So you can sort of see there, each of these lizards can interbreed with their neighbors, but they can't interbreed with the ones opposite them. And so they if you look at it, it kind of forms this kind of ring around the species, and so it's a bit confusing. Are they all one species? Are they all different species? Are they all subspecies? And so using that definition can also be confusing. We actually call this a ring species. In other words, several different groups being able to interbreed with one another, but not with opposite sides. Okay. So that's the biological definition. Now, the new way and the modern definition is kind of the most recent method in which we identify and classify species. We classify according to DNA and chromosomal similarities. How that sort of works is that we make this assumption that if organisms have a certain percentage of DNA that is similar to one another, they must be the closest related. Yeah. So, for example, if you look at this kind of little tree here, we would assume that if C and D are 95% similar in DNA, they must be the closest related. And then if B and D are 90% similar, then they must be the second one. And then A and D must be 80% similar. And so that's kind of the assumption that we're making. Yeah. And so whilst it is probably a little bit more sure in identifying the species, it also factors in a few different kind of things that you have to assume. You have to assume that at some point all organisms were related, which is somewhat debatable. And also, how do you know that C is closest related to D or closest related to B, right? And so that's the kind of confusing part that you sort of have to try and figure out between them, okay? Now, if we look at the modern definition here, there are some really cool discoveries that they've sort of made using DNA sampling to identify species. Yeah. So if we look at the DNA sequences between humans and a whole host of different organisms, you can actually see similarities between segments. Now, interestingly to note that in terms of sequences for codes for protein, we share about 100% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but the segment between the genes is only 98%, and so they consider, many scientists will consider that chimpanzees are our closest relatives. Okay, dogs will share 99% of proteins genes, but only 52% of the segment between the genes, and you sort of, as you work your way down, it decreases. Yeah, and you would assume that therefore we are least related to roundworms and most related to chimpanzees. Yeah, we use the same method, and we've actually made some really cool discoveries. For example, elephants, whilst they look like they might be related to other large kind of ungulates and things like that, they are actually more related to the manatees and the hyraxes. Yeah, dogs are actually very closely related to walruses, which is quite surprising because you would think that walruses would be more related to things like dolphins, for example, right? The killer whale and the cow are actually really closely related as well. In fact, cows are actually more related to killer whales and dolphins than they are to pigs and alpacas and things like that. Yeah, so all those things. So those are some pretty cool discoveries that we've made there.